Well, good evening and buenas noches to those of you who also speak Spanish. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
On behalf of Old Dominion University's libraries, I would like to welcome you to Stop Trying to Make Fake News Happen. The topic of fake news is ever present in our lives, from breaking news about the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election to Twitter spats between politicians and news organizations. And the term fake news has become so common among all of us that, as Jesse Richmond shared with me this morning, Collins Dictionary today named it the word of the year because they deemed it the most used new expression. As fake news becomes more prevalent, it is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish whether a story is fact or it's fiction. So how do we start thinking more and more like a fact checker to verify whether a news story is legitimate before we like, share, or retweet it? Luckily, our distinguished panelists are here to answer this and many more questions and to share their expertise on the subject of fake news. So joining us tonight are Wavy TV weekend anchor Brandy Cummings, graduate student in international studies Laura Hajidimova, the Virginian Pilot news researcher Jakin Hayes, the Virginian Pilot senior editor Jeff Reese, Associate Professor of Political Science Jesse Richmond, WODU Studios General Manager Ronald Rugg, and Assistant Professor of Communication and Theater Arts and English Sean Sadri. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our panelists. To kick off our discussion, each panelist will give a 3 to 5 minute presentation, and I will then facilitate questions that many of you submitted in advance. And finally, there will be an opportunity for you, our audience, to ask questions. After the event concludes, students who wish to receive extra credit, and I heard there were a few of you here, for attending will receive their exit tickets as they leave the room. And now, without further ado, Brandy, would you please kick off the panelist presentations?
Mic check, there we go. Very familiar with doing that. I'm sorry, I should have turned that on before I got started. My name is Brandy Cummings. As you just heard, I'm the weekend evening anchor reporter at Wavy TV. I've been at Wavy for 3 years, although I've been in broadcast journalism for 13 years, spending time in newsrooms in Georgia and South Carolina before getting here. I think one of the things that is incredibly important to convey from the broadcast journalist side of things, if you will, we often operate in immediacy, which means that it's even more important for us as an organization, as journalists, to be accurate, to make sure the information that we are receiving and, of course, disseminating is accurate. Just in researching a little bit for the panel, if you will, Merriam-Webster said actually the term fake news started more than 100 years ago, right? So it's not really a new term per se, but it has gotten more attention over the last year. November 2016, of course, is when Google Trends says it blew up. So if that puts it in perspective a little bit. I think the word often has been used more recently when someone else deems information to be inaccurate. However, the truth is that fake news describes what has been published as hoax articles that are published to exploit biases and get clicks, things that have no basis in truth. But I know that we're going to explore a lot more of that tonight, and so that's just my little introduction. So I'm excited to be here and excited to be able to have this discussion with you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura, and I'm coming from Bulgaria. I'm a PhD student in international studies. Previously, I was here for another master's degree in the humanities program, and even before this, I got a law degree from Sofia University, Bulgaria. My experience with fake news is extensive since Bulgaria was a part of the communist bloc, and actually in the communist bloc, we didn't have fake news, we only have news, but in the context of the really strong propaganda, it was actually disinformation. something that I'm gonna talk a little bit later. My interest toward fake news will be further investigated, hopefully for my dissertation. I will be focusing on cognitive security. I'm not even going to say that it's a growing field, it's a brand new field, and I believe it's immensely important, mostly because human mind can be used as a powerful weapon in terms of democratic systems. It's not illegal, it's actually supported, it's cheap, and it's very effective, and it can be used for political agenda. I'm going to pass the microphone now.
Hello. My name is Jakin Hayes. I'm a news researcher at the Virginian Pilot. I've been at the Pilot for 17 years now. My role has transformed quite a bit since my time there, with when I first arrived, our discussions about this interesting new search tool called Google, up to today where we are wondering whether or not we should use Google for some of our research. But part of my job is I feel that I'm really involved in the front lines of the battle against fake news. At the Pilot, we were established in 1865. We have archives reaching all the way back to 1865. So I have access to over 150 years worth of local information that I can quickly tap into in the case of a question presented to me by an editor or a reporter. Like Brandy mentioned, when the term fake news came up and President Trump said that maybe I invented fake news, I was able to look into our archives and discover that we actually printed the term fake news in November of 1902. So, no, he didn't invent that term. And so I can quickly tweet that out and disprove his claim. And that's just a very minor instance of some of the fact-checking that I do in the research department. Let me see what else. I guess that's about it. I'll pass it on to Jeff.
Check. My name is Jeff Reese. I'm a senior editor at the Virginia Pilot. I basically run the newsroom. While tonight's panel is going to discuss mainly what fake news is and how it's invaded our lives, one of the things I'd like to remind everyone is one of the pernicious things about this fake news is that real news is being accused of being fake news. And that is almost, if not worse, than fake news itself. It muddies the waters and it makes it hard to distinguish between what's real and what isn't. So one of the things I would encourage everyone to do and take away from this panel tonight is basically educate yourselves on how do you read news, how do you verify what's real and what isn't, and how do you account for your own biases. That's the main thing you learn as a professional journalist, is accounting for your own biases, because that's the only way you gain credibility. So that's all I have.
Hello, I'm Jesse Richmond. I'm an associate professor of political science and international studies here at Old Dominion University. I'm here for two reasons. One, fake news, as it's exploded, has become incredibly important in politics. We've seen fake news in all kinds of respects. And Donald Trump's viral use of all kinds of statements have exploited a changing media environment that really feeds into fake news. One of the things we've seen is just a transformation of the information as we live. As we move from the development of more and more technologies, the cost of becoming a media producer has dropped to more or less zero. And what that means is anybody from a Russian pretending to be a nativist American citizen or a Black Lives Matter activist to a legitimate citizen who wants to take part in the process can step in and become a news maker more or less for free. And that's part of what's generated the capacity for fake news to become as viral and chaotic as it has. I think if we look at history, we've seen similar moments of transition before, though, and perhaps that provides some perspective. Each of the big transitions in media has been accompanied by social upheaval as some people have figured out how to exploit them, often for nefarious ends, and eventually things have settled down in some new way. We're at the early stages of what it means for the media to be digital and production to be free. We've seen a lot of, there's the explosion on Google of fake news. Donald Trump thinks he coined it, sort of making fake news meta fake news about claiming that one has invented fake news. But it's important politically because arguably this played a major role in the recent American election. And it's not just the Republican-Democrat issue or something like that. This isn't Democrats trying to beat up on Trump's victory or something like that. If you look at the Russians are playing all sides of this, trying to disrupt our society and our democratic culture in a variety of ways. And this is really important for us to think about, I believe, as citizens of this republic, think about how we collectively make decisions and how we collectively come to a sense of what the actual facts are and what the fake news is.
Maybe. Hello. All right. So my name is Ron Rugg. I'm the manager for WODU Studios. I manage a lot of the different departments we have there, number one being video and news. One of the main things that we do is we try to educate on how to go forward into that type of industry. So making sure that people understand and our students understand how to fact check. Some of the stuff like what Mr. Richmond was saying is it's not anymore a Democrat or a Republican issue. It's a cultural issue. So having people understand that and having people understand what it means to be a broadcaster, what it means to be a research analyst, what it means to work in those fields and to get the story right is important. So that's what we focus on. We focus on bringing to light what is actually true and teaching those how to bring to light what's actually true. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Sean Sadri. I'm an assistant professor in the Communication and Theater Arts Department. I've been here for 3 years. Before I got my PhD, I worked in television news for about 2 years. So I've been a journalist, and now I do a lot of research in the journalism field. I kind of see myself no longer as a journalist, but someone who's preparing students to work in this field, students to, be journalists eventually, because that's what a lot of my students want to do. So I try and give them tools and tips of ways to sort of, increase their credibility as journalists. So that means having a professional, Twitter account, having a professional profile online. Because I think, for the most part, the most important thing a journalist can do is be a check on those in power. Basically, check on those in power and be a check on those that are running the country. And I think when the people running our country are saying that the news isn't real, then it sort of diminishes their credibility and it sort of diminishes the whole journalism process. So I think it's really important to sort of have that check on those in power, and I think that's what I'm trying to get my students to understand. So thank you.
Thank you. In addition to what you shared, I would love to hear from you. Jesse, you've been the subject of this as well as some of the faculty members too. Their research has been used and added to the fake news to spread misinformation as part of the campaign. And I don't know if Jesse or someone would be willing to address that too.
Yeah, but let's saw the spike for Donald Trump's use of the term fake news. I got to be part of his own production of fake news. I published a study several years ago with a student looking at whether non-citizens participate in U.S. elections. Trump and some of his allies took the very top-end estimates and then multiplied them by a couple of times to come up with even more ridiculous estimates to try to persuade people that American election results are illegitimately undermined by massive voting by non-citizens. My research doesn't show that. It shows that in extremely close elections, they might tip a balance, which is very different. But this provided the factual grain. This study by Jesse Richmond and Gulshan Chadha and David Ernst at Old Dominion University showed by the factual grain, the site that they can give to then lend credibility to exaggerated disinformation about the state of our elections.
Well, thank you for sharing how faculty members as well have been a subject of having their information misused for the purposes of fake news. Well, thank you all for the timely discussion. Our Old Dominion students have been researching the subject of fake news, and they have put together some thought-provoking questions for our panel. The first question goes to Laura. How do you define fake news, and do you think the definition has changed during the past couple of years?
Thank you for this question. I will start with the question of information. There is no agreement in literature what information actually is. How do we know something is true? How do you know something is fake news? And this leads us to the ultimate question, do we have ultimate truths that we all share? And the answer is no, we don't. Critical theorists will say that when we are telling a story, we're going to put a little piece of ourselves in the story, and that will be our reflection, our perspective in evaluating the events. So, leaving these very abstract questions aside, let's talk a little bit about what is misinformation and what is disinformation, as opposed to information as a concept. Misinformation will be different than disinformation in a way that misinformation will reflect lack of information, and disinformation will give the wrong information with a political agenda behind it, usually political agenda. So we're going to have a distinction as a purpose. Behind disinformation, we have a purpose, and misinformation, we may have an honest mistake, misrepresentation of events, and disinformation will be a purposeful misrepresentation of events, highly subjective and reflecting a hidden agenda usually. Going further, I'd like to say again that the fake news are not something new. They have become popular, but they've always been there. They have existed in the Cold War in the form of propaganda. We all know about this. And I would like to address how disinformation and misinformation pertains to the concept of propaganda. Since propaganda has a purpose, we'll have disinformation. Misinformation is possible, but unlikely. So when we're thinking about propaganda, we should put a sign, we should think about disinformation mostly.
Thank you, Laura. And I know during your introduction, Jacob, you mentioned how the pilot had seen fake news term in 1902. How do you think it has evolved from 1902 to today?
The evolution. Well, So in 1902, obviously, you didn't have the outlets such as television. You didn't have Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, Tumblr, all these social networks to distribute information. You had the Virginian Pilot, competing newspapers, and words of mouth. So fake news was there. It would spread, but not at the rate that it is doing today, that it's happening today. I think you had a slide up there earlier, Professor, about that. So we see that evolution, and so it's not only on a local level, you have a national and an international level. So in 1902, like I said, you had the newspaper. Today you've got YouTube. It could spread to the Chinese social networks. It could spread to the Middle Eastern social networks. So it's quite a transformation from simple newspapers and word of mouth to what we have today.
And much harder to contain as well.
Yes, and my thought on that is it's only going to get worse. It will evolve beyond this, what we have today, with technology, and I think that should be entertained in this discussion as well, what the future holds, so we can possibly be prepared for that.
Thank you, Jake. And I know, Jeff, you wanted to make some comments as well.
So the one thing I would remind you, though, is even though the term fake news has gained currency recently and has been around for 100 years, conceptually it's been around forever. And if you look at the Revolutionary War era in the United States, the newspapers and pamphlets of the time, they basically peddled fake news all the time, and that was the internet of the day. So before we think we're in some unique time, just reflect on, this has always been a problem. And as the professor mentioned, as we move through time, these things kind of rise and fall. There's self-correction at some point. And right now we're at the beginning of it where everything looks bleak and everything looks chaotic. But hopefully what will rise from it is people actually starting to seek out credible news sources to kind of separate, the wheat from the chaff.
That will be a welcome change by all. And the next question is for Brandy and Laura. How has the relatively new popularity of the term fake news changed the day-to-day experience of your profession?
Well, that is a great question. It has changed, I think, what we do quite a bit. I think that as journalists, it makes us, quite frankly, it makes us be much more cautious about the way we tell stories. It does sharpen us a bit because you do have to make sure that you check and double check again your sources, because you never want to be accused of something, although we are. You never want the accusation to actually be true. In that same vein, though, I think that there have been instances where, unfortunately, journalists do things that then allows for further distrust. I think that there have been some instances where there have been situations and things that have happened that contribute to this belief and this idea that all news is fake. And so I have a slide that I'd like to show. So I don't know if you all remember this. This was November 2016. This is Lindsey Davis. She's an anchor for ABC News. She was in South Carolina. The story she was covering was a real story. There was a woman that had been held captive in a storage container by a sex offender. An actual story that had actually happened, and all the networks were covering it. We were covering it as a local story as well. However, the part of this that was not accurate, that was fake news, if you will, if we can go to the next slide, was the crime scene tape. This actually came about and became a huge deal, especially for us in broadcasting, because we deal in visuals. So while we are journalists and the story matters, the information matters, we're also visual. So a huge part of what we do is what you see. So what it appears, and of course I don't know this to be the reason they did this, but what it appears is they put up crime scene tape for aesthetics, for the live shot, for that morning. This picture, however, was obtained by CNN, and then it circulated on, guess where? Social media. And so it led to some serious conversations in our newsroom about how we go about delivering the stories that we tell. The other part of this, though, is that this began to call into question, I won't say began, but it continued to call into question, even on the local level, what we do. So if a viewer sees this from an ABC News in New York, then our conversations were, will they believe if we're standing in front of crime scene tape? And so even as journalists, we still have to step back and kind of say and think, what implication will something else that happens somewhere else have on us and our ability to have the trust of the public and have the trust of the people with whom we are serving? Because journalism really is about service. So we're not doing this for ourselves, we're serving the public, and we are representing the voice of the public and for people who would not have access and would not be able to speak. So that's one aspect of how things change for us. Another piece is something that recently was created by CNN, and I want to just play this little video that we found, if we can, right now.
This is an apple. Some people might try to tell you that it's a banana. They might scream banana, banana, banana over and over and over again. They might put banana in all caps. You might even start to believe that this is a banana. But it's not. This is an apple.
Right? So it's clever, it's cute. But for CNN, as you all probably know, they have been accused of being fake news. So they recently created this campaign to say, hey, we're about facts first. And I just thought that video was incredibly interesting. And I think for them, not speaking for them, of course, but I think that has changed the way even they have to deliver the news that they do. Because years ago, I don't know that we would have had a commercial like that coming from CNN. I don't know that they would have had to prove that they deliver facts first. But in this age now, what we see now, it appears that they are having to, as well as I think on the local level, we in some cases have to defend our stories, our coverage, and the way we tell our stories.
Thank you, Brandy. And Laura, what are your thoughts on this?
I have actually two perspectives. The first one is a relatively scholarly perspective, and the second one is a legal perspective. And from the scholarly perspective, I must say that fake news have influenced political events a lot, mostly the elections in Europe, in the US, everywhere. And speaking about the recent elections in Bulgaria, I must tell you that a lot of very small parties were elected and are now part of our parliament, mostly because of fake news and the proliferation of fake news. We actually have a lot of websites that are popular with disseminating fake news, and we have little to no control on these websites, and people continue to trust them. And this brings another question: how do you trust the source from which you're, looking to obtain information? From a legal perspective, it's really hard to limit websites that disseminate fake news. Democratic systems are actually supporting the spread of information. We have social media, and it's not only the social media and the websites that are in the social media. Sometimes they refer to other websites, and there's this chain of websites, and you cannot really see the end so that you can find the primary source of this information. In addition, I must say that Facebook is trying to limit fake news. I don't know to what extent they are successful with this. it is a good sign that actually something is being done, and efforts are made in this direction. As a person, I will shock you probably to say that I am enjoying fake news, and do you know why and when? Because I know that they're fake news, and I'm looking for the political agenda behind them. I know a few people that are usually sharing on social media some information that is usually fake news, and I'm very curious to see what's the purpose. Usually, these fake news are a reflection of someone's perspective. They're looking to achieve something, and I'm always curious, what are they trying to achieve? However, I'm enjoying fake news because I know they're fake. Of course, I read a lot because political science is my major, and that's how I know they're fake news usually when it comes to politics. But we recently played a game in which you gotta guess if something is fake news or not, and I failed because most of the news weren't political. I failed dramatically. It was very difficult to distinguish between fake news and real news. So always question, when you see that some piece of information is fake news, it could be misinformation, no purpose, it could be an honest mistake, or it could be disinformation and someone trying to plant an idea in your head. So please question this when you're reading fake news, and you can enjoy fake news and disinformation knowing that it is fake news or disinformation.
That's very good advice, Laura. And for all of those of you that were wondering about the game that she's mentioning, University Libraries has actually placed on the website for this event a link to a game, and all of you are invited to play along and see how you test on that and whether or not you were able to distinguish between fact or fiction and news. You remember earlier during the introductions, Jeff made an interesting point that real news today is being accused of being fake news, and I'm wondering if you can expand on that. How does that statement change the way that you look at stories? Are you constantly making sure that you have a stronger balance between liberal thought, so to speak, as it's being accused of being, or the conservative thought?
Well, it isn't so much about the political balance, but it does start to make you question some basic, what you used to think were basic concepts of journalism. And I'll give you two instances in which I look back at something we covered, and I wonder if I would do it as I did it at the time. So a couple of years ago, in completely separate incidences, the mayors of Portsmouth and Norfolk had untruths disseminated about them in the media. And at the time, I thought, this is a no-brainer decision. Of course we're going to cover this because part of our mission is to set the record straight. That's what you do. You're a journalist. You set the record straight. We've been doing this for over 100 years. In both cases, the mayors blasted us for our stories and were quite upset with us for running these stories. And at the time, I just thought they were being petty. I thought that they probably didn't read the story, which I still think is probably true. And that they didn't realize that what we were up to was actually to set the record straight. We were on their side. We were showing that these untruths did not apply to them. In light of what's happened in the past year, I now look back at that and wonder, well, damn, maybe they had a point. Because here's the thing. We now know that studies have been done that repeating a lie, even with the purpose of correcting it, actually helps to spread it. And so what I thought was a no-brainer decision 2 years ago, now I would have to actually contemplate. Am I doing more harm than good by trying to set the record straight? Is there a different way to do it? Can I do it in a way in which I don't repeat the lie? Is there a way to mitigate it? So what were easy decisions just 2 years ago now would take a lot of discussion and a lot of forethought about how we would cover it. And to me, that's the biggest impact I've had on my own profession, my own career.
Any others? Well, Jesse and Brandy, how does fake news go viral? Do you have an experience to share in which your organization was impacted by a fake or manipulated news story that went viral? I know earlier, Jesse, you touched a little bit on this with your research.
Yeah, so I did touch on it a little bit. How does it go viral? I think it goes viral when people want to share it. And it goes viral when people are somewhat careless about trusting others who agree with them. And I felt for much of the last year or two with that study I mentioned that it was really an experience of seeing how our current media environment with its echo chambers makes almost all of us stupid. No matter what side you were on, I felt like you were pretty much getting a distorted version of the study. Either the study was totally worthless, don't pay any attention to it, nothing there, there's absolutely no non-citizen voting, forget that. Or on the other side of it, it's enormous, it's a threat to our democracy. Right? Both idiot statements, there's a little bit of it, and it's something that, along with a variety of other threats to the integrity of the election process, some of which are probably larger and some of which are smaller, we should be thinking about. And so I think the current environment, often what happens is not the totally fake that's maybe the most dangerous, but the spun. And there's so much spun news where people on one side or the other are mostly paying attention to that side, and you end up getting a limited, distorted, inaccurate sense of what the world's really like that suits your partisan or political or other ideological failings and limitations and tastes in a way that makes you feel very righteous but probably doesn't serve you or anybody else well.
And Brandy, I'm sure you have several stories about how your organization has been affected by these manipulated stories.
Oh, absolutely. One of the panelists said that one of the challenges with dealing with and addressing fake news is this idea that anyone can be a journalist. I take personal offense to that because I went to college and have this definition of a journalist because I have a degree. So anyone is not a journalist. Anyone can take pictures, anyone can spread and share information, true or false. However, anyone is not a journalist. Let me just say that in defense of all the journalists on the panel. However, as a journalist, there are certain expectations that we have given to us from the public, obviously our managers, and just as journalists, there are certain things that you would expect from us. One of the things that recently came up for us, there was a story that we covered, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, actually in October. Unfortunately, there was a situation with a mother and daughter. They were found dead in their home in Virginia Beach. At the time, one of our reporters interviewed a family member who said they believed that bullying was a factor in their deaths. Police, who is a source for us, and I say a source because police is not the only source, they are a source of information that oftentimes is reliable. However, there are times when sometimes their information is inaccurate. The police source in this story said that they did not have any reason to believe that there may have been bullying involved. There were rumors that were being spread about this being a suicide or bullying or many different reasons. Police said, we are going to wait on the report from the medical examiner. As you know, the medical examiner does an autopsy which verifies the way a person may have died. Before the medical examiner's report came out, as a matter of fact, to my knowledge, it has not yet come out, in fact. There was a post on a Facebook page for a Black Lives Matter activist. This post talked about a completely separate story in that regard. The post talked about a child who had been dragged by a teacher in a Virginia Beach school. So as a journalist, curious journalist, my idea at the time was to contact this activist and try to talk to the mother to find out more about what happened. And so in talking to this activist, we were, of course, using social media, going through the Facebook Messenger. I said to him, I'd like to get in touch with his mom. His response to me was, are you talking about the suicide and the situation in school? And so I was somewhat familiar with the story of the mom and daughter, but again, we had not reported that there was a suicide. So I was completely oblivious to what he was talking about. I said, well, what suicide? I said, well, first of all, as a media organization, we typically don't cover suicide. So I wouldn't be doing a story on that. It would simply be to talk to this mom to look into whether or not we would be doing a story with her. So we go back and forth. After an hour or so, he responds to me and says, I will not be giving you the mom's information because we want to do both stories. And we want to do this big, his words, we want to do this big. And because you're not interested in doing a story on both, we are going to give this story to another or other progressive reporters. So I said, okay. And so I sent that email to the other progressive reporters in my newsroom. And I said, let me just let you know about the conversation that I just had with this gentleman. So the next thing we realized, the next day, this post was put on Instagram from that same activist. I'll read it for you if you can't see it. The news refuses to take this story because it's a suicide, 12-year-old bullying, #fake news. In his post, he says, sad, oh, by the way, he tagged Wavy, 13 News Now, WTKR, 4 broken hearts, saddened by the refusal to cover this story due to suicide, #anti-bullying, #suicide awareness month. The reason I bring this up is because, as I mentioned, police have yet to confirm or say, or anyone for that matter, to say whether or not this was a suicide, whether or not bullying was involved. But because we opted to do more research, because we opted not to use his message or take his story, his voice as the platform for this story, we then became fake news. And so that's why I say so often we deal with this in the sense that when someone may not agree with the way we tell a story or whether or not we do a story, we get this label of you're fake news. Everything you do is fake now because you don't want to do the story that I want to do. It has been called publicly akin to being a child, little kids, and they get mad. It's like, okay, well, your outfit is ugly anyway. So we take that as journalists. We take it, we deal with it, we are still human. So we struggle with that sometimes. This idea that as hard as I work, as much research as I put into the stories, as much passion as I put into the stories, that someone could still accuse me of being inaccurate or being fake because we choose to have a higher standard of the way we tell our stories. But like I said, this is still out there, and it's still a story that we probably will cover. And we actually did cover this story. To give you the rest of it, one of my colleagues actually had already done an interview with the mother. So there was a story that we were already planning to do. However, this activist planned a news conference related to both this story and the story with the child who'd been dragged into school. And so it became somewhat of a story about the activism and less about the families, the people that were involved. And that's what we did not want to do. Because sometimes the voice of the activist becomes louder than that of the person who may have been involved, and we chose not to do that. So stay tuned. So you may see more about this coming up, but this is a very recent example of how fake news has impacted the way we do and the way we cover our stories.
So now we see that the definition of fake news has actually expanded to include not following your journalistic guides and also not going out on a story quick enough. That's really interesting. And as Brandy mentioned, a lot of this fake news accusations were spread via social media. And so my next question is for Ronald and Sean. What barriers do you think the use of social media and the sharing of news on social media have created for our general public in regards to being informed citizens?
Hello. Okay. All right. So social media is a very large part of a college campus. It is what drives most of just about anything that happens when it goes to basically anybody in the generation after my generation. I am that in between where I grew up in the information age where things were just kind of forming and social media was evolving. And in the last few years, social media has evolved a lot, just specifically in probably the last 3 to 5, with the introductions of things like Twitter and Instagram and things like that. So really what it comes down to is that fake news really hasn't changed itself that much. It's the distribution that's changed. It's the ability and it's the availability that has changed with fake news. So when it comes to the terms of social media, it has basically given a platform for anybody to be unchecked when it comes to what they share and who they share it with. Most people on social media are friends with people because they are like-minded. They are people who support the same things. They like the same sports teams. They like the same TV shows. They go to the same movie theaters. Those people are going to distribute something on social media that you're going to agree with, for the most part. Not always, but for the most part. What used to take a lot of effort in distribution of something propaganda-wise or fake or misinformation, it doesn't take that much anymore. Brandy talked about how she took offense to being told that anybody can be a journalist, and she's right. Not everybody can be a journalist, but anybody can cause gossip, which is honestly what it is. And you can report kind of anything you want. You can share anything you want. You can tag anything you want in any way that you want. How many active students do we have out here right now? So how many of you remember last year's viral video, racist viral video, right? So that is a really good example of how quickly misinformation can spread. That was a video that was recorded not by a current student, not even on this campus, but somebody wearing a sweatshirt, wearing an identifying sweatshirt. It wouldn't have mattered if they were wearing a Redskin sweatshirt. It wouldn't have mattered if they were wearing a Panther sweatshirt or any other type of sweatshirt. That, whatever was on it, would have been tagged as part of it. That is the problem with misinformation, that we lump everything in to one person's actions. And one person's actions can actually be way more impactful in the distribution of misinformation than most people realize. And really, it comes down to that what I talked about earlier, which is that it's a cultural issue. How do you change that? Because the responsibility is on us as the reader or as the viewer to take that information in and decide what we're going to do with it. And there is a generational gap divide, however you want to define it, between what was once considered trusted news sources and what is not anymore from the perspective of the viewer. So how do we educate the youth of today, and honestly many adults, into how to get that information right? And when they see that come up on their feed, how do they interpret that and go out and search out the real story?
I have a follow-up drill down question in regards to that. So earlier, Jeff said that correcting a lie can help to spread it. So what do you do? Either any of you.
That's actually. Let's go ahead.
So we actually agonized over this story. I mean, we agonized. It first popped up. There was about 1,000 people on YouTube. I was like, okay, there's only 1,000 people. We're not doing anything on this. We're just skipping this. And then overnight it just blew up. And we absolutely agonized over how we handle that story, because now it was a thing. And that's one of the things Ron was talking about, is the media used to be the gatekeepers of information, and we are no longer the gatekeepers. Social media is it's the Wild West, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm not bemoaning that, but what I am saying is it's changed our job. And that was a story that we absolutely agonized over how we approach it and how we pursue it. And so one of the things we did was quickly social media started pegging certain people in the community as being the likely suspect here. So we actually tracked those people down as best we could and told the story from their point of view, which was the best way we could do it without kind of spreading the perniciousness of the racism part of it.
Yeah, so the that specific story was something that came to WODU. I believe it was like a Saturday night, if I can remember right. I got an email. I happened to be up. Got an email about 1 a.m. that had a link to that video. First thing I did was download it, so I had a copy for myself in case YouTube decided to take it down.
They did.
And I immediately emailed just about everybody in the university administration I could remember was in charge of something. The point is that when something like that happens and you realize that there's not enough information to really understand what's going on here, you have to be able to allow time for people to get that information and decide what they're going to do with it. The university had an obligation to respond, and I didn't think that it would have been responsible for anybody from our department or anybody else that might have gotten their hands on it to tag a university at 2 a.m. and ask what's going on when they really had no idea what was going on a Sunday. So that allowed time for, and I think I actually, honestly, I emailed a couple of editors at news sites as well and attached it to that, so that way we could, in case that somebody didn't have it, that there could be some form of response by the time everybody woke up on Sunday morning, because let's be honest, most of us were sleeping in on Sunday morning. So by the time that happened, we wanted to make sure that there was something going on to at least have answers. And what he's talking about with the targeting, we saw it was way worse than most people realize. I mean, there were people getting tagged from social media here and there. It's this person, it's that person, and some people were really afraid. And that's the reality of something like this that can be caused by an instance like that.
Yeah, so several of the panelists talked about how this all sort of originates on social media. That's where people see all these fake news stories. But no one really talked about where all these stories are actually coming from. The reality of it is there's actually plenty of fake news websites all over the world where they're publishing all these stories. If you're wondering why all of these, why there are so many fake news websites, it's because essentially they all earn about $10,000 to $30,000 a month in ad revenue. So that's where it is. It's a really lucrative business if you have no moral compass and don't really care that you're spreading all this fake news. So NPR actually tracked down this guy who owns several fake news websites, and he actually admitted that he's hired 20 to 25 writers who literally just all they do is publish fake news stories. That's all they do. They sit there every day and they publish fake news stories for his fake news websites. Because I mean, essentially, he's trying to make money off of it. He knows what stories will get shared. He knows how to deal with search result optimization, so these stories are appearing in Google. He actually even talked about this guy who owns these websites, and he's a very liberal person, but he knows that most of the stories that are going to get shared are going to be the really conservative stories. He actually he wrote a fake news story claiming that Colorado residents, after they passed legalization of marijuana, Colorado residents were buying marijuana with food stamps. And then a Colorado law was actually proposed aiming specifically at preventing people from buying marijuana with food stamps based off of this fake news story that he had created. So that's essentially what happens. I mean, literally one media organization picks up this fake news story, and then it gets shared on social media, 10, 20,000 times, and then essentially, it becomes fact, even though it was completely fake. So that's sort of where all these stories are coming from, in case you guys were wondering.
I can just see people already sharing it on social media and asking their friends to help support this effort, right? Yeah. Sign here. And Brandy, I know you had some thoughts as well.
I did. So, Sean, to that same point, I also did some research on this, and 60 Minutes did an investigation in March. And there were several also fake news sites, the National Report, the Denver Guardian, One of the stories that was posted on one of their sites was about an Ebola outbreak in Texas. Got up to 8 million page views. This particular person, though, that created this site said that he compared his stint, I'm quoting here, as a fake news writer to the work of fiction writers. So, we talk about why they're doing this and where this stuff comes from. These folks are saying, hey, it's just fiction, and, Sean, as you said, they are making thousands and thousands, millions of dollars by doing this and completely fooling the public, unfortunately.
So we've talked a lot about the barriers that this has posed for us, but what about the flip side? How has social media helped the general public to become more involved citizens in news or fake news situations?
Okay, so I think social media is a great tool. It really is. We've harped on it quite a bit, and I don't think that there's any denying that it's great. I'm former military. Social media is amazing. It allows you to connect and stay connected with people no matter where you are in the world at all times. Now, the reality of social media, because of that, is that you are not always getting the full story. So to be informed and to be involved in what is actually going on is you have to really look at the story that's being shared. You have to understand that when you're looking at whatever is shared in your feed, it's like I said, it's the like-minded, and that it's a lot of times many people are nailing themselves deeper into the corner that they stand in because of that. And you're not, so really it comes down to how involved are you really in the news if you're doing that, if you're not seeking out a greater perspective, if you're not looking at the other side of the coin, are you really involved at all? Because you're just kind of riding the train at that point. So it only kind of takes that moment of clarity to sit down and go, how much of this can I actually understand? How much of this can I actually look at with any form of perspective and say that this is real or this isn't real. So when you're getting involved into what may or may not be a real news story, you have to look at that. You have to look at that perspective. Where is it coming from? Where are you getting? Where is that information being disseminated at? How many is it? Is it for likes? Is it for clicks? Is it for scrolls down the page? What is its intent? Because you can pick out what that might be. So when you're getting involved with that story, is there a clear headline? Headlines are designed to catch your interest. That's true. But when the headline reads, "You'll never guess what Walmart just did," most likely you want to click on that because you want to know what Walmart just did. All right? Everybody wants to know what Walmart just did. But that doesn't give you any information. So to be involved, you have to do that research. It's not just read it in the paper and it's true anymore. The overall media, the evolution that all of these great panelists have been talking about, has reached that tipping point, to the point where it's no longer on the burden of the presenter, it's on the burden of the reviewer.
So Sean, what are some ways that we, as the audience, can find out whether a story is reliable or not? What are some other ways?
I mean, one thing you guys should always do is don't just look at a headline and then just, if you agree with it, just automatically share it. I think that's one of the problems with social media, Facebook, Twitter, is that people will retweet things and share things that just, it has an eye-catching headline that they agree with. There's this concept of selective exposure and selective perception, as in we select what we're exposed to. We seek out news stories that coincide with our own beliefs. And then if we find something that doesn't go along with our current beliefs, we perceive it to be fake. So that's the reason you see so many people claiming fake news, on stories that are actually legitimate. I think one of the things you should do is, like, if it has a ridiculous, if it's associated with some sort of ridiculous website that doesn't really have a legitimate name to it, if it's not the New York Times, if it's not the Washington Post, then you can pretty much determine that this isn't probably real. So make sure you actually click on the article, read it, make sure everything seems legit, and make sure you're not sharing it. And if one of your friends or one of your family members shares something like that and it's not real, you should actually call them out and tell them, this isn't real, you should take this down, and basically call them out for sharing fake news.
And do it at Thanksgiving.
And so what are some ways that we can also practice responsible consumption? You've talked about necessarily not sharing the fake news, but what about consuming the fake news? Jesse?
So the problem of fake news is nothing new, as people have pointed out, and we've experimented with various efforts to solve it over the course of American history. The John Adams administration, they got very, very angry at the way the French, a foreign power, was trying to intervene and propagandize in America, and they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were rightly criticized by Thomas Jefferson and others as a violation of civil liberties, right? So there's a temptation to try to solve fake news by censoring it. Let's arrest the printers or the bloggers or something. I think we have to find other ways to solve this problem than that. Part of it is talked about being responsible consumers of the news. Don't trust everything you see on YouTube or Facebook or most anywhere else. Follow up. Look at what the sources are. Look at how much evidence there is. Look at whether there's spin on the story. Try to get multiple sides of the story. I think